How do deists and practitioners of CCT today determine their destinies with divination?
Most common of the methods are those that involve the use of bamboo sticks and crescent-shaped blocks. In CCT temples, devotees approach a barrel crammed full of long sticks containing combinations of trigrams called hexagrams, or, alternatively, numbers from 1 to 64, the total number of combinations of the 8 trigrams. Grabbing a handful of sticks, they shake them and then let them fall back into the barrel. Invariably one stick will protrude above the rest, and it provides the critical symbol for that individual to interpret. When sticks are numbered, devotees request a corresponding slip of paper from the temple staff. On the paper they then read an often enigmatic or poetic interpretation of the corresponding hexagram. Devotees can also drop a pair of crescent-shaped blocks with one smooth side symbolizing yang and one convex side symbolizing yin. Devotees pose questions as they drop the blocks. One yang and one yin side up means yes, while the other combinations mean no. Worshippers unsatisfied with a particular answer may simply continue dropping blocks until they receive the desired response.
What is the link between Feng Shui and Daoism?
Feng Shui, a term meaning wind and water, is a type of terrestrial divination designed to help practitioners make practical decisions about living arrangements that will be in harmony with natural energies and forces. This symbolic system coordinates critical elements of time and space to allow for maximum harmony in every conceivable human interaction with nature. All natural features, including trees, rivers, mountains, and valleys, for example, have their distinctive influences on the flow of energy. Failure to take of these forces into account can make life much more difficult than it need be. In practical terms, Feng Shui assists people most of all in choosing the orientation and design of the built environment, in other words, architecture and urban planning. A geomantic compass allows people to arrange the spaces in which they live and work in accordance with the principle of the 9 palaces. The compass indicates where yin and yang energies flow. A grid of 9 squares, each of which contains 3 numbers from 1 to 9, can be used in connection with building plans to indicate optimum placement of particular kinds of spaces within a home or office, e.g. storage, study, eating, or sleeping spaces. This ancient environmentalist system has grown from careful observation of the consequences of human interaction with the greater cosmos. Chinese tradition emphasizes the need to conform with the way of nature rather than attempting to dominate it.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in deist worship and prayer?
Specific lists of objects vary somewhat among the different schools and sects. Here are the most important ritual devices of the Celestial Masters school. First and foremost are the ubiquitous talismans that consist of a written magical formula or mantras symbolizing a contract between the deities and human beings engaging in a ritual exchange. Only a qualified ritual specialist may execute a talisman, which usually includes a specially drawn Chinese character as well as other visual symbols appropriate to a particular spiritual purpose. Possessors of talismans generally think of them as guarantees of divine aid. People wear them or hang them in home or office to attract positive energies. The precious sword of the 7 stars, symbolizing the Big Dipper, appears often in blessings and exorcisms, whether for individuals or as part of cosmic renewal observances. As a symbolic purification to the cardinal directions, ritualists sip from a copper bowl and blow a spray through closed lips. Special stone seals of various kinds allow the specialist to make official documents such as talismans. Priests hold a stiff tablet, as if reading from a book. In exorcism rituals, black hats use the sword along with handbells, while red turbans use a horn and a whip.
Is meditation important in Daoism or CCT?
Dominant forms of devotional expression in CCT tend to be associated with more extroverted ritual and supplicatory prayer. Classical and later Daoist sources, on the other hand, describe various meditative methods designed to help the practitioner turn inward. In fact, Chan Buddhism, the Chinese precursor to the more famous Japanese Zen, seems to have borrowed much from Daoism in this respect. The meditator sits and forgets in the presence of nature, engaging in the fast of the mind. Principal stages in Daoist meditative technique are the following. First, the meditator calms the body by adopting a fixed posture and slow, regular breathing. As the meditator becomes one with his or her breathing, distractions begin to dissolve. To develop greater concentration, the meditator chooses a specific symbolic focus for detailed visualization. In the next stage, the meditator moves beyond this discursive intellectualizing into the fast of the mind. Leaving behind all symbols and ideas, the meditator enters a realm where images are irrelevant. Finally, the meditator loses all sense of self and attains union with the Dao.
What is Neo-Daoism?
Neo-Daoism is a name commonly given to various developments around the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Some scholars suggest that there were 2 recognizable schools. One was called secret mystical teaching, Xian Shui. According to some interpreters, an important theme was its emphasis on the quest for physical immortality. Earlier Daoist sources had spoken of immortality. but generally of the spiritual rather than the bodily sort. Neo-Daoism recommended exercises in breathing, diet, use of potions, elixirs, and talismans, and sexual activity reminiscent of Hindu and Buddhist tantric practices. But perhaps more fundamental in this alchemy were intense meditative practices intended to reveal the Dao within the individual. Some scholars interpret Qian Shui as developing out of Confucian rather than Daoist thought. A major feature of the second school, known as pure conversation, Qingtan, is its attempts to blend aspects of Daoist, Confucian, and Buddhist thought. Among its proponents were the so-called seven sages of the bamboo grove, whose penchant for detached philosophical discourse and the cultivation of a Daoist aesthetic were among their hallmarks. On the basis of their reading of the Zhuangzi and Dao De Jing, they developed a neo-Daoist interpretation of the so-called Confucian classics. After the 5th century, Buddhist concepts infiltrated the movement to such a degree that neo-Daoism gradually lost its distinctiveness and identity.
In brief, what is the history of religious Daoism?
Religious Daoism emerged as a recognizable tradition in its own right during the latter decades of the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 221 CE. Confucianism enjoyed imperial favor as the official creed of the state. But when the Han Dynasty disintegrated, both Daoism and Buddhism found room to grow. The early Celestial Masters school dominated the Daoist scene for the most part. Various schools teaching forms of alchemical Daoism developed early on and have continued throughout the past 2,000 years. In addition, new revelations claimed by various teachers gave rise to several new schools between the 3rd and 6th centuries, times of political fragmentation. See below for discussion of individual schools and denominations. With political reunification during the Sui, 581 to 618, dynasty, Daoism's various schools managed to survive in spite of meager imperial support. Many monasteries flourished but remained apart from the general populace. Things improved under the Tang dynasty, 618 to 906, when Daoists once again had friends in high places. Under the Song dynasty, 960-1279, Neo-Confucianism proved a powerful rival for Daoists at court. But Daoists fared well anyway, since many Neo-Confucians gladly exchanged ideas with Daoism's leading lights. During the Southern Song dynasty, 1127 to 1279, in spite of an almost complete lack of public imperial patronage, several new Daoist schools sprang up. Things took a turn for the worse under the Yuan dynasty, 1260 to 1368. Daoists invited to participate in court debates suffered serious setbacks and paid dearly with the loss of monasteries and precious libraries. During the late medieval Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, Daoist fortunes improved again dramatically and many Daoist masters enjoyed prominent official positions. But under the last of the imperial regimes, the Qing, or Manchu, dynasty, 1644 to 1911. The pendulum swung the other way and religious Daoism struggled to survive the early modern period. Through the periods of the First Chinese Republic, 1912 to 1949, and the People's Republic, 1949 to present, Daoism has held on largely thanks to the establishment of several organizations designed to provide a public presence for the various orders and schools. After disastrous losses as a result of the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76, Daoist religious groups are again struggling to pull themselves back together.
What other early sacred texts are especially important for Daoists?
A text known as the Zhuangzi, named after the man whose disciples may have authored it, dates from about the 4th century BCE. The work is also known as the Divine Classic of Nanhua. The town to which Zhuangzi was believed to have retired. Zhuangzi, the Daoist philosopher, c. 389–286 BCE, remains a relatively little-known figure. But the work that bears his name stands out as a foundational document in philosophical Daoism, whose interpretation of basic concepts also influenced many religious Daoists. In addition to its bold attacks on the inadequacy of Confucian teaching, the Zhuangzi presents essentially the same worldview as the Dao De Jing, especially the importance of non-effort, wu wei, or unmotivated action and its political implications. Zhuangzi emphasizes the concepts of longevity and immortality that would later take on great significance for many religious Daoists. Perhaps more important is the concept of mental purification called fasting of the heart. Zhuangzi's teaching has become an important element in Daoist mysticism, speaking often of a kind of oneness with the Dao. A Daoist philosopher named Li Zi is likewise said to have penned a work that bears his name. That book, also known as the true classic of the expanding emptiness, however, was almost certainly of a later time, and Li Zi is probably a legendary figure, containing materials of many different literary types, especially narrative forms such as anecdotes and parables. The book was probably compiled around 300 CE. Its 8 chapters arrange their literarily disparate materials thematically, addressing such topics as fate and human freedom, problems in establishing ethical standards, and the challenge of following the Dao. Here for the first time we hear of the Isles of the Blessed, home of the immortals. Like the Zhuangzi, the later work speaks at length about the complete freedom experienced in becoming one with the Dao.
What are some other important celebrations for Daoism and CCT?
Deists observe days special to the three officials, or officers or rulers, whom CCT call Shun, Yao, and Yu, on the 15th days of the 1st, 7th, and 10th lunar months. Their days are associated respectively with heaven, earth, and water. The heavenly official, Shun, ranks highest and remains very popular in Taiwan, for example. The water official, Yu, is celebrated for having saved the world from uncontrolled flooding. Three deist deities considered at the pinnacle of the pantheon are known as the three primordials. Their festival days coincide with those of the three officials, respectively. The first two of which also coincide with the CCT Lantern Festival and Ghost Festival.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT run private religious schools for their children?
People born into Chinese families with a long history of associations with Daoism or CCT, or both, grow up hearing about traditional beliefs. They participate, practically from infancy, in family home, and perhaps also temple rituals, and almost certainly learn the ways of ancestor veneration. There has been no need, generally, for an educational network designed to preserve ancient beliefs and practices. Traditional values, some believe, are being steadily eroded by the increasing pace of change the world over. It may be that if time-honored Chinese ways of being religious are to survive well past the millennium, those vitally interested in that survival will have to develop more formal, deliberate ways of instilling the tradition. Movement in that direction may already have begun with the revival of Daoist seminaries in the People's Republic of China.
Who is Guandi and why is he so important?
Like the Jade Emperor, Guandi, also known as Guangong, claims a place in both Daoist and CCT pantheons. He has the additional distinction of ranking high in the upper echelons of the imperial cult, and through that channel connects with Confucian tradition as well. Guandi was originally a military man of the 3rd century, named Guan Yu, who was executed after enemies of the Han dynasty captured him in battle. The court funded temples in his honor and publicized his cause. Meanwhile, the newly deified Guandi was gaining popularity among practitioners of CCT as a refuge from problems as diverse as illness, bad weather, and failing business. The ever-ready all-purpose deity thus rose to such prominence that his popular cult situated him above even the Jade Emperor. In the 17th century, a Ming dynasty emperor conferred on Guandi the title of Grand Emperor. During the following regime, that of the Qing or Manchu, Guandi received the title under which he is perhaps most widely known, Military Emperor or Wu Di, thus making him the official guardian of the empire. Guandi's celebrity represents a relatively recent development. unlike many of the older deities whose imagery and entourage were typically patterned on those of the imperial bureaucracy, Guandi is reminiscent of the Buddhist bodhisattva. In fact, some scholars suggest Guandi also was absorbed into certain Buddhist groups after the 7th century. It seems likely that, as in the case of other indigenous Chinese deities, Guandi was first depicted under the general influence of Buddhism's use of sculpture. He appears as a very tall man with a very long beard and a red face, sometimes accompanied by his son. Variant versions of his story give somewhat different details. As in the popular classic Chinese novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, of which Guandi is the hero. Many popular theatrical presentations based on the novel have become a major vehicle for the spread of Guandi's popularity.
What are some of the main varieties of deist officials or specialists?
Since about the 4th century CE, religious specialists called Daoshi, masters of the Dao, have led deist communities at prayer. These leaders can be celibate monks. There are also nuns called Daogu, who live almost exclusively in monastic communities. Monastic priests, mostly members of the Complete Realization Order, occasionally perform public rituals. But, not unlike cloistered monks in some other traditions, their principal focus is on their more private spiritual pursuits. Some ritual specialists are married family men who live near a monastery. These so-called lay masters, Shigong, make up the majority of deist ritual specialists. Individuals generally specialize in certain types of ritual, such as exorcism and faith healing. Among the non-monastic, those ritualists whose functions most closely resemble those of priests in various other traditions are called the Black Hats. Many of them belong to the Celestial Masters School, perhaps the oldest of all deist organizations. In addition to the Black Hats, the official and intricately trained priests, there are the red turbans known as Fashi, specialists in the occult. Black Hats, so called because of their small mandarin cap with a gold knob on top, are authorized to perform both the greater festivals and the more ordinary ceremonies to which the red turbans are restricted. The two groups are alternatively known as blackheads and redheads. Specialists of earlier times called libationers in the Celestial Masters School had the triple duty of religious instruction, local administration, and ritual leadership. Not unlike the typical parish pastor in many Christian denominations.
Is there a system of deist religious law?
Apart from the charters or disciplinary codes of deist organizations such as monastic orders, there is no such thing as formal deist religious law. The very idea goes against the grain of the concept of natural balance and harmony that is so central to deist thought. That is not to say that there aren't countless standard practices and expectations as to behavior. The difference between Daoism and, say, Islam or Christianity, in this respect is that the Muslim and Christian traditions have systematically codified those expectations while the Daoist has not. Every cultural and religious system has its standards and sanctions. But in the cases of both Islam and Christianity, independent legal systems became necessary largely because the religious traditions expanded into new cultural settings very different from those in which the traditions arose. In the case of Daoism, religion and culture have been much more closely and consistently identified, making a separate system of religious law largely unnecessary.
Who was Lao Zi?
Lao Zi was likely an altogether legendary figure whose name simply means old teacher or master. Tradition says he was born around 604 BCE, making him a much older contemporary of Confucius. Kongfu Zi, 551 to 479 BCE, who was in turn an almost exact contemporary of the Buddha. The legend says Lao Zi was a clerk in the archives of the Zhou dynasty who practiced the way and its power and emphasized self-effacement and anonymity. When he became convinced that social disintegration and political corruption in the Zhou dynasty were irreversible, he decided to withdraw from society. Riding his water buffalo, the old man came to the frontier. There a customs officer besought him to write down his lofty teachings before departing. Lao Zi wrote the Dao De Jing, the classic of the way and its power, and disappeared, leaving a legacy of mystery. Much later stories, perhaps from a time when Daoists and Confucians were in competition for followers, tell of a meeting between Lao Zi and a youthful Confucius. No use wasting so much time studying your history, Lao Zi counseled the newcomer. Observe nature and you will see that love for the Dao is all that one needs. Popular tradition tends to identify Lao Zi as the one who first taught that ordinary folk could seek and attain immortality. Some scholars suggest that Lao Zi's legendary stature may have been enhanced as a result of his mistaken identification with the legendary Huang Di, known as the Yellow Emperor who ruled in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. Lao Zi was officially declared a god around 666 CE.
What is the relationship between Daoism and martial arts?
Early each morning, nearly everywhere in China, people gather in public places both large and small to practice a slow graceful routine of physical movements called Tai Chi Chuan. People of all ages can engage in this activity, though it is not strenuous the way higher speed exercises can be. Tai Chi, also commonly spelled Tai Chi, nevertheless puts noticeable demands on an astonishingly wide range of muscles all over the body. The idea is not simple physical toning, however, even though that is an obvious benefit. Its purpose is to maintain or restore one's overall sense of health and well-being through relaxed concentration. Proper practice relieves blockages of vital energy and returns the whole person to balance and harmony both physically and spiritually. Tai Chi routines and styles are varied, with 3 methods called Chen, Wu, and Yang most common nowadays. Many of the underlying principles in the practice are of Taoist origin and remain a regular part of the regimen in many Taoist monasteries. But it seems more reasonable on the whole to identify Tai Chi as a more generically Chinese phenomenon, since for centuries non-Taoists have made use of it with no apparent direct connection with Taoist beliefs. As for its relationship to actual martial arts, Tai Chi movement is based on the notion that non-aggressiveness, what is called being weak like water, is ultimately more effective than trying to overwhelm one's opponent with brute force. Hence, for example, the Japanese term judo derives from a Chinese term, rodeo, that means the way of yielding.
What do Taoists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
Taoists call the ultimate spiritual reality Tao, the way. Long before the formal beginnings of Taoism's various movements and school, Chinese tradition used the term Tao as a general ethical notion implying the appropriate and moral way of acting. As so often happens when a religious tradition enters a new cultural setting, Buddhism's arrival in China led some thinkers to talk of a Buddhist way in contrast with which they began to define an indigenous Chinese way in the sense of religious beliefs and values. Taoist philosophers emphasized the unfathomable mystery of the Tao, but they viewed it as non-personal power rather than a personal divine entity. The religious equivalent seems to have been a deity called the Supreme Oneness, Tai Yi. The Tao Te Ching's description of how the transcendent Tao became manifest suggests a type of emanation. Tao gave rise to the One, which produced the Two, and so on. That grand and uplifting description of the ultimate mystery still remained a bit too abstract for most people. As a result, when the first schools of religious Taoism began to formulate their beliefs, they naturally gravitated toward more concrete imagery. That included the deification of the individual, long believed to represent the way as an accessible teaching, namely Lao Zi. The process also led to personification of certain essential features of the mysterious Tao in the form of the heavenly triad called the Three Pure Ones. Developments of this sort multiplied, and the deities took on life stories and personalities that invited devotional interaction. In practice, the many personifications of divinity are arrayed according to an administrative structure parallel to that of the imperial bureaucracy. Religiously speaking, of course, the reality is just the other way round. The imperial institutions imitated the heavenly order of things.
Is there a deist or CCT creed?
Since religious Daoism and CCT emphasize practice over correct belief, they have not formulated the equivalent of creedal summaries such as those of Judaism, Islam, and even Buddhism. Daoism and CCT do, of course, presuppose certain basic beliefs and assumptions about how the world works. Most of those beliefs have to do with discerning and understanding how to cope with and benefit from the spiritual forces inherent in all things. All of the varieties of religious Daoism and CCT, therefore, have their core beliefs. But affirming one's assent to them pales in insignificance when compared to the importance of grasping the essential skills needed to negotiate life's daily challenges.
How are deist leaders chosen and given authority?
Traditional deist priesthood has long been a hereditary occupation. Though that appears to be changing in recent times. This feature obviously applied consistently only to non-celibate branches of the priesthood. Individuals who successfully completed requisite initial training are ordained, following general patterns similar to those of Buddhist monastic practice. Ordination requires a quorum of ordained priests, and the ordinand takes refuge in the Deo, the canon of scripture, and the tradition's spiritual teachers. Much as the Buddhist monk takes refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Lay specialists, whether black hats or red turbans, apprentice to an authoritative master called a Daojang, perhaps the equivalent of high priest. His task is to lead novices through several levels of ritual assistantship. Students begin with basic musical accompaniment. Learn to watch over the incense burners, and lead group prayers. More difficult training includes learning to chant and memorizing often intricate rubrics. Ritual movements. After learning to copy sacred texts and write talismans calligraphically, aspirants are ready to lead ritual. In the People's Republic of China, some seminaries still provide formal doctrinal instruction. But that is generally not the case in Taiwan. Formal ordination focuses on the symbolism of the master conferring the seal of priesthood and the texts the specialist will follow. Some scholars suggest the training of black hats is more rigorous and literate than that of the red turbans, who tend to serve less official, more popular functions and have much in common with the shamans of old.
Who are the 8 immortals?
Three historical and 5 legendary persons believed to have achieved immortality figure prominently in Chinese religious lore. Daoist sources tell of many other mortals who have achieved immortality. but these 8 are especially important. Chinese religious lore contains many sets of 8 trigrams, precious objects, cosmic directions, for example. The immortals, Xian, are in some ways analogous to Christianity's saints and Islam's friends of God. Lu Dongbin, originally a patriarch of the Complete Realization School during the 8th century, generally leads the group. He usually dresses as a scholar and carries a fly whisk. Some images show him with his magical sword. One of the 8 Daoist emblems. Lu is patron of barbers and is celebrated for his healing powers. Li Taiguai, a purely legendary figure whose emblems are the gourd and crutch, appears as an old crippled beggar. He champions the weak and marginalized and is a patron of pharmacists. Zhang Guolao lived sometime between 650 and 750 CE. Capable of making himself invisible, Zhang appears riding, often backwards, on a white mule which he could roll up and tuck into his sleeve. His emblem is the percussion instrument made of a bamboo tube and 2 sticks, and he is the patron of elderly men. He Xiangu, the lone female of the group, holds a bamboo ladle, a lotus or basket of flowers, and sometimes the peach of immortality. She is said to have lived around 700 CE and is noted for her asceticism and kindness. Han Xiangzi is the patron of musicians. He carries a flute and is known for his spendthrift ways and delight in mountain solitude. Zhongli Chuan is supposed to have been a soldier of old who failed in battle and became an alchemist. Apparently once a historical figure. The aging and portly fellow eventually ascended to heaven on a stork and now carries a fan. Lan Cai is a strange figure among strange figures. With 1 foot bare and 1 shod, sometimes appearing as a woman, sometimes as a boy. He carries a basket of flowers and is patron of florists. Cao Guoju, patron of actors, carries a pair of castanets or, alternatively, a jade court tablet that was his entry pass and from which the image of castanets may have developed. Tradition makes this 8th immortal the brother of a Song dynasty empress and dresses him in royal finery. The whole octet are still widely popular and sought out for their magical powers.
Have women exercised leadership among Daoists?
One of the most famous libationers was a woman named Wei Huakun, 251 to 334 CE. Her rank as libationer apparently indicates that she originally belonged to the Celestial Masters school. Some regard her as a foundational figure in the Shangqing sect. She is perhaps most famous for having appeared posthumously on many nights over a 6-year period to reveal to a certain Yangshi the sacred texts of the Shangqing sect. Those texts consist mainly of liturgical ritual. Throughout its long history, the Celestial Masters school has allowed women into the lower rungs of its ritual hierarchy. up to but not including that of Celestial Master itself. Another school, called Pure Rarity, Qingwei, is said to have been founded by a woman named Xiaoshu in the early 10th century. Centered around a thunder deity, the sect blended elements from the Lingbao, Shangqing, and Celestial Masters schools. There have been many priestesses over the centuries, and a celibate community of women maintain a temple in Kaohsiung, Taiwan. Hagiographical sources are extant on a number of holy women of ancient times. They make it clear that women who preferred to pursue the spiritual life rather than devote themselves to family risked almost certain disapproval. Even so, it seems that some women were associated with religious orders. Sun Buletin er, 1119–1182, and her husband were both ritual specialists in the Perfect Realization Order. And she founded a new division of the school dedicated to the religious education of women. A selection of her writings in translation is available in Thomas Cleary's Immortal Sisters. Secret Teachings of Taoist Women. A sect associated especially with the red turbans is popularly called San Nai, Three Ladies. Evidently so named to honor a trio of priestesses about whom little else is known. As has often been the case in other religious traditions, many Chinese women have found possibilities for active leadership and ministry more often outside the institutional structures than within.
What is the main source of information on Lao Zi's life?
The main source of information on Lao Zi's life is a biography written by the historian Si Ma Chen, 145–86b. CE, in his Records of the Historian. By this time a number of beliefs about the founder of Chinese Daoism were circulating, and Si Ma Chen himself was unsure of their authenticity. The biography, in fact, contains an account of not one, but three, men called Lao Zi. The first Lao Zi was a man named Li Er or Lao Dan who came from the village of Churen in the southern Chinese state of Chu. Li Er served as historian in charge of the official archives in the Chinese imperial capital of Luoyang. He was a contemporary of Confucius and is reported to have granted an interview to the Confucian master when he came to Luoyang seeking information on the Zhou ritual. Another man identified as the founder of Daoism was Lao Lai Zi, who also came from Chu. He is designated as a contemporary of Confucius and is credited with a 15-chapter book expounding on the teachings of the Daoist school. Nothing more is known about him. According to a third account, the original Lao Zi lived 129 years after the death of Confucius. This man went by the name of Tan, the historian of Zhou. Scroll volumes. Every imaginable variety of text is available in the modern 60-volume reprint of the canon. 12 subdivisions arrange the material as follows: primal revelations, talismans, scriptural interpretation, or exegesis, sacred diagrams, historical texts, ethical texts, Ritual texts, practical techniques, biographical information, sacred songs, and memorials. Most of the various sects and schools of Daoism focus on one or a select few of the many possibilities the canon offers. As we shall see later, recitation or chanting of sacred texts forms an important part of some ritual observances.
Is there a standard Daoist group liturgical worship?
Most of the ritual activity one can observe at temples throughout the day consists of individual or family worship at various times during the day. Members of pious organizations may gather for group chanting of liturgical prayers. The priest may address a sermon to such gatherings as well. Major Daoist sects have devised their own special communal rituals, and some have survived intact into our time and are still practiced, especially in rural areas and more traditional villages. Many of these involve group chanting of sacred texts, in imitation of the chanting of the assembled gods themselves when they created the universe. One important communal ritual is that based on the teachings of the Lingbao sect. Elaborate theatrical liturgies address issues and powers in 3 levels or registers: the celestial, the terrestrial, and the human. The golden register of rituals honors the family of the emperor at the celestial level. A terrestrial level called the yellow register is aimed at peaceful rest for the deceased. The now discontinued jade register once focused on securing salvation for all people. The officiants and their ritual implements mediate between the divine and human participants. Rites once dedicated to the emperor and his court are now undertaken on behalf of local or family groups known to uphold religious standards. Observances begin with an evening or vespers prayer to announce the start of the rituals and symbolically reconstruct a sacred realm in which to enact the rites. Great attention goes into setting the ritual scene. A miniature of the cosmos with gates at the 4 cardinal directions. Action resumes the next morning with a fast and an offering. Imitating a creative divine act, the officiant recreates the sacred space by pacing out creation and journeys symbolically to the heavens to bring down heavenly powers. As part of the ritual, the master, or priest, meditates silently, focusing on visual imagery as a way of bringing health to the assembled people. The entire ritual ends on the next day with the master facing the assembly as one now returned to earth. He then dismantles the altar, burns the sacred texts, and sends the deities back to their heavenly abodes.
Is the term revelation useful in understanding Daoism or CCT?
Most Daoist sects and schools, and CCT generally, teach that religious truths are embedded in virtually all levels and facets of reality. Access to those truths is available largely through the mediation of ritual specialists and spiritual masters. Their task is not so much to disclose the mysteries as to facilitate the passage of power from the realm of gods and spirits to that of human beings. When ordinary people find themselves in the neighborhood of these spiritual powers, the truth behind them remains mysterious and cloaked in ambiguity. There are, however, accounts in which famous masters and sages claim to have received explicit revelations or missions directly from a deity. When deists speak of the language of revelation in these relatively rare instances, they suggest that they are pointing only to the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. The whole truth remains hidden from view and available only to a select few. This contrasts markedly with the general thrust of the Abrahamic traditions, for example, where revelation implies the disclosure of the full truth insofar as human beings can fathom it. Finally, an experience called divination writing deserves mention. Here, since it is occasionally described as a revelatory medium, the Shangqing school claims to be based on a series of nocturnal revelations. Founder Yang Shi reported that heavenly beings came to him in a vision and caused his hand to write the sacred texts.
Are there deist hierarchical structures?
Since there are many different sects and schools, there are no official and universally acknowledged hierarchical structures that unite all deists. But there are de facto hierarchies, both religious, within individual deist organizations, and social, based on a broader kind of class consciousness. For example, in the Celestial Masters School, the living heavenly master functions as a sort of archbishop, overseeing the running of the school's temples in the region. Within the administration of the school, ranks are named after those of the imperial bureaucracy, such as libationer, recorder, and director of ceremonies. The Celestial Masters School has retained much of its ancient hierarchical structure today. In addition, each of the various monastic orders is internally structured according to authority and leadership roles, with the equivalent of an abbot at the head. Hierarchical structures have also been very much a part of the several short-lived attempts to create theocratic states, but their claims to authority were naturally limited. Within their everyday lives, most deists would likely be aware only of the functional hierarchy inherent in the more elaborate ritual celebrations. There, a high priest presides, while subordinate priests perform much of the ceremonial action and musical accompaniment. Other non-ordained assistants busy themselves with the overall mechanics of the ritual, keeping the action moving by making sure necessary supplies are plentiful and other practical matters are in order.
Who is the Jade Emperor?
One of the more intriguing personalities in the Daoist and CCT pantheons is the Jade Emperor, Yu Huangdi. His emergence as a power to be reckoned with in popular worship offers important insight into the dynamics of Chinese religion generally. During the 5th and 6th centuries, Yu Huangdi was but one among many relatively minor deities. During the Tang dynasty of the 7th through 9th centuries, he gained prominence as a result of the appearance of a new text called the Jade Emperor Scripture, Yu Huangjing. It tells how centuries earlier a queen had dreamt that Taishang Dao Jun, second of the three pure ones, handed her an infant. She awoke and bore a child, who after a short time as a young prince, withdrew to mountain solitude. Lengthy spiritual discipline transformed the youth into the Jade Emperor. In the 10th century, a Song dynasty emperor named Zhenzong, r. 998-1022, chose Yu Huangdi as his patron deity and spread word of an expected revelation that came in 1008 in the form of sacred scriptures, thus bolstering the weak emperor's position. Thereafter the Jade Emperor rose to the top of the popular pantheon, thus becoming the CEO of a divine bureaucracy. Stories like that of the Jade Emperor help to explain why enumerations of the Daoist and CCT pantheons are sometimes a bit confusing.
Did Daoist tradition spread beyond China?
Daoism has exerted some influence at various times all over East and Southeast Asia. Wherever Chinese have traveled, Daoism has gone and left its mark. But it rarely has made its presence felt dramatically outside of China and territories under Chinese control. Daoist teachings, however, have had a significant impact on Chinese Buddhism over the centuries. Buddhism in turn has transported those usually well-hidden contributions on its missionary road throughout Asia. In relatively recent times, Daoism, and teachings that claim to be Daoist, have begun to enjoy increasing popularity in Europe and the Americas, but on a much smaller scale than other traditions of Asian origin.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Daoism or CCT?
Most of the various schools and sects of Daoism can point to at least one source or compendium of their central teachings. In that sense, there is such a thing as Daoist doctrine. A body of doctrine does, in effect, define the boundaries of some of the schools, especially the more esoteric ones, and sets them apart from one another. But even in those instances, the doctrinal core is largely subordinate to a given school's central rituals and practices. CCT, on the other hand, does not define itself according to any clearly articulated doctrinal system. Children learn from their parents and extended family of elders a host of convictions and practices of the sort often called folk beliefs. where there is no formally defined doctrine. There can be no dogma in the sense of a minimum required for membership. Of those deist schools and sects that have developed distinctive doctrinal tenets, only the most esoteric have even approached the kind of official dogmatic pronouncement one finds. For example, in Roman Catholicism.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT make pilgrimages?
Pilgrimage has long been integral to most of the major Chinese religious traditions. The Chinese term typically translated as making pilgrimage, Chaoshan Jinxiang, actually means paying respects to a mountain by presenting incense. Beginning in at least the 4th century CE and growing dramatically from the 8th to 12th centuries. Pilgrimage practices of the various traditions came to be identified with certain specific mountains, with some mountains claimed by more than one tradition. Once identified as a particularly sacred place, a mountain became the site of one or more temples. Eventually deists and others developed elaborate sacred geographies, mapped out with reference to the major sacred peaks or ranges. Pilgrimage to the sacred mountains thus became a symbolic journey through the universe. On some mountains, such as Wudangshan, deists have constructed miniature versions of the macro COSM, identifying its subdivisions with such enchanting names as Jade Void, Primordial Harmony, Purple Empyrean, and Perfect Felicity. Mountains are the dwelling places of the gods and immortals, and as such, naturally became favorite places of retreat for deist scholars and masters. Mountain settings have other, more primal, symbolism for deists as well. They embody the perfect harmony of male yang and female yin. Deep within mountain caves, spiritual seekers could contact the eternal feminine energies. Popular pilgrimage has generally revolved around visits to the mountain temples rather than around extended spiritual retreat. A deity called generically the Old Man of the Mountain, often depicted with his pet tiger, appears in many temples all over Asia, including Buddhist sites, making a symbolic pilgrimage possible even for those who cannot manage the actual journey. Today, various organizations arrange pilgrimage tours to any of several dozen sacred sites in the People's Republic and in Taiwan.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT make pilgrimages?
Pilgrimage has long been integral to most of the major Chinese religious traditions. The Chinese term typically translated as making pilgrimage, Chaoshan Jinxiang, actually means paying respects to a mountain by presenting incense. Beginning in at least the 4th century CE and growing dramatically from the 8th to 12th centuries. Pilgrimage practices of the various traditions came to be identified with certain specific mountains, with some mountains claimed by more than one tradition. Once identified as a particularly sacred place, a mountain became the site of one or more temples. Eventually deists and others developed elaborate sacred geographies, mapped out with reference to the major sacred peaks or ranges. Pilgrimage to the sacred mountains thus became a symbolic journey through the universe. On some mountains, such as Wudangshan, deists have constructed miniature versions of the macro cosm, identifying its subdivisions with such enchanting names as Jade Void, Primordial Harmony, Purple Empyrean, and Perfect Felicity. Mountains are the dwelling places of the gods and immortals, and as such, naturally became favorite places of retreat for deist scholars and masters. Mountain settings have other, more primal, symbolism for deists as well. They embody the perfect harmony of male yang and female yin. Deep within mountain caves, spiritual seekers could contact the eternal feminine energies. Popular pilgrimage has generally revolved around visits to the mountain temples rather than around extended spiritual retreat. A deity called generically the Old Man of the Mountain, often depicted with his pet tiger, appears in many temples all over Asia, including Buddhist sites, making a symbolic pilgrimage possible even for those who cannot manage the actual journey. Today, various organizations arrange pilgrimage tours to any of several dozen sacred sites in the People's Republic and in Taiwan.
Do acupuncture and acupressure have any deist connections?
Neither acupuncture nor acupressure is a specifically religious practice. They are associated with healing, but both draw on ancient Chinese principles that have found their way to the center of deist teaching. Illness indicates a lack of qi, the vital force, which courses through the body along an intricate system of meridians. Blockage of vital energy causes an imbalance of yin and yang. Traditional deist-influenced maps of the body associate particular nodes with specific symptoms and internal organs. The whole system is based on a carefully observed network of correspondences. Not only is every part of the human body connected to every other part and to the spirit, but the human microcosm parallels in every detail the macro cosm of the universe. Proper placement of acupuncture needles, or appropriate application of pressure to the malfunctioning energy juncture along any of the meridians seeks to restore the flow and balance, and hence promotes the rise of vital energies that are the essence of health and well-being.
Do acupuncture and acupressure have any deist connections?
Neither acupuncture nor acupressure is a specifically religious practice. They are associated with healing, but both draw on ancient Chinese principles that have found their way to the center of deist teaching. Illness indicates a lack of qi, the vital force, which courses through the body along an intricate system of meridians. Blockage of vital energy causes an imbalance of yin and yang. Traditional Daoist-influenced maps of the body associate particular nodes with specific symptoms and internal organs. The whole system is based on a carefully observed network of correspondences. Not only is every part of the human body connected to every other part and to the spirit, but the human microcosm parallels in every detail the macrocosm of the universe. Proper placement of acupuncture needles, or appropriate application of pressure to the malfunctioning energy juncture along any of the meridians seeks to restore the flow and balance, and hence promotes the rise of vital energies that are the essence of health and well-being.
Is music important in Daoist and CCT ritual?
Music has been an essential ingredient in virtually all indigenous Chinese religious ritual for millennia. Students of Daoist masters are expected to begin their formal training by becoming accomplished in the use of a full range of string, wind, and percussion instruments. These ancient devices include not only the mysterious booming gongs and bowed or pluck strings many readers may already associate with Asian music, but the less well-known woodwinds whose high reedy voices produce an almost eerie effect. Daoist ritual music has been related to imperial court music and, somewhat more recently, Chinese opera. Ritual music aims at stirring feelings uniquely appropriate to the occasion. In these last several respects, Daoist ritual music has much in common with the music that is an essential ingredient in many Shinto ceremonies in Japan. Two percussion instruments used to keep time for chanting and recitation of scripture are virtually identical to those used for the same purpose in Buddhist ritual all over Asia. Large-scale chanting on especially solemn occasions is accompanied by an ensemble of 4 or more instruments of various types. Percussion instruments along with other wind and string instruments back up the lead played on oboe-like woodwinds, lutes, and bowed strings. When a single master recites a sacred text, a solo instrument is generally the only accompaniment.
Is music important in Daoist and CCT ritual?
Music has been an essential ingredient in virtually all indigenous Chinese religious ritual for millennia. Students of Daoist masters are expected to begin their formal training by becoming accomplished in the use of a full range of string, wind, and percussion instruments. These ancient devices include not only the mysterious booming gongs and bowed or pluck strings many readers may already associate with Asian music, but the less well-known woodwinds whose high reedy voices produce an almost eerie effect. Daoist ritual music has been related to imperial court music and, somewhat more recently, Chinese opera. Ritual music aims at stirring feelings uniquely appropriate to the occasion. In these last several respects, Taoist ritual music has much in common with the music that is an essential ingredient in many Shinto ceremonies in Japan. Two percussion instruments used to keep time for chanting and recitation of scripture are virtually identical to those used for the same purpose in Buddhist ritual all over Asia. Large-scale chanting on especially solemn occasions is accompanied by an ensemble of 4 or more instruments of various types. Percussion instruments along with other wind and string instruments back up the lead played on oboe-like woodwinds, lutes, and bowed strings. When a single master recites a sacred text, a solo instrument is generally the only accompaniment.
What about dance?
Liturgical dance is just as important as music. During the festival of cosmic renewal, for example, the principal ritual specialist performs a dance of shamanic origin called the Steps of You. The dancer traces the outline of the Big Dipper to commune with the god of the pole star. He ascends symbolically into the heavens to visit the 3 pure ones. Some dances engage the assembled community of worshippers, as when all gathered celebrate the new light by circumambulating the altar. Another dance functions as an offertory procession in which worshippers bring offerings to the ritual leaders who in turn present them to the gods.
What about dance?
Liturgical dance is just as important as music. During the festival of cosmic renewal, for example, the principal ritual specialist performs a dance of shamanic origin called the Steps of You. The dancer traces the outline of the Big Dipper to commune with the god of the pole star. He ascends symbolically into the heavens to visit the 3 pure ones. Some dances engage the assembled community of worshippers, as when all gathered celebrate the new light by circumambulating the altar. Another dance functions as an offertory procession in which worshippers bring offerings to the ritual leaders who in turn present them to the gods.
Do Taoists pray in any particular language?
Since Taoism originated in China, one would naturally expect that most practitioners of the tradition pray in Chinese. That is so not because of any essential identification of Chinese as a sacred language or liturgical tongue as such. Use of the vernacular has been the general practice in Taoism. And until recently it happens that most practitioners have been Chinese speakers. So as small pockets of Taoist practice have arisen here and there outside China, especially in recent times, practitioners have used their native tongues in ritual.
Do Taoists pray in any particular language?
Since Daoism originated in China, one would naturally expect that most practitioners of the tradition pray in Chinese. That is so not because of any essential identification of Chinese as a sacred language or liturgical tongue as such. Use of the vernacular has been the general practice in Daoism. And until recently it happens that most practitioners have been Chinese speakers. So as small pockets of Daoist practice have arisen here and there outside China. Especially in recent times, practitioners have used their native tongues in ritual.
Are there any other important Daoist ritual settings apart from public temple and private home?
Perhaps the most common Daoist sacred space is the spectacular, yet temporary structure unobtrusively called an altar, 10. Usually set up in large open fields or vacant lots. Multi-level facades made of bamboo and covered with colorfully decorated paper simulate grand architectural spaces. These altars are the scene of the major festivals, qiao, that extend over several days. They enshrine such popular deities as the Jade Emperor and Zhang Daoling. Afterwards, the altars are taken down and the decorations burned. Several other ritual venues have been important as well, though not all intended for larger gatherings. Organizations within the various sectarian movements that have come and gone throughout the history of Daoism have typically practiced their own unique and often esoteric rituals. Always preceded by elaborate purification, these specialized rituals could take place either in natural settings, such as remote mountain retreats, or in enclosed meditative venues called purity chambers. Their initiates would closet themselves for lengthy periods of disciplined mental focusing.
Are there any other important Daoist ritual settings apart from public temple and private home?
Perhaps the most common Daoist sacred space is the spectacular, yet temporary structure unobtrusively called an altar, 10. Usually set up in large open fields or vacant lots. Multi-level facades made of bamboo and covered with colorfully decorated paper simulate grand architectural spaces. These altars are the scene of the major festivals, qiao, that extend over several days. They enshrine such popular deities as the Jade Emperor and Zhang Daoling. Afterwards, the altars are taken down and the decorations burned. Several other ritual venues have been important as well, though not all intended for larger gatherings. Organizations within the various sectarian movements that have come and gone throughout the history of Daoism have typically practiced their own unique and often esoteric rituals. Always preceded by elaborate purification, these specialized rituals could take place either in natural settings, such as remote mountain retreats, or in enclosed meditative venues called purity chambers. Their initiates would closet themselves for lengthy periods of disciplined mental focusing.